This is Ihab Abanuwara. Now, he's an Arabian who has joined the church. He's been in Saudi Arabia most of his whole life. His title in his article is Into the Desert, an Arab View of the Book of Mormon. Now, this is significant because now we're getting someone from that culture and from that area of the world to describe the Book of Mormon from that particular viewpoint. It's very interesting. This essay is a personal reflection on the Book of Mormon from an Arab viewpoint, he says. Members of Arab or Middle Eastern origins can provide insights into understanding and reading the Book of Mormon from a Middle Eastern point of view. My hope is that such insights will enrich our understanding of the book's Middle Eastern origins and cultural imprints. The interesting thing is, the Arabians recognize those cultural contacts. It's really real. It's not something Joseph Smith could have made up. A number of images and emotions have resonated within me as I have read and interacted with the Book of Mormon for the last 2 decades. And I've just marked bits and pieces of his essay. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. It's free online. You can get it. But the amazing thing is, this touches a core reality within him. And I think that's fascinating. As I consider how I respond to this book as an Arab, I'm drawn to the story of Lehi and his family as detailed in 1 Nephi. The conflicts, the struggles, and the fears of Lehi and his family as they make their way out of Jerusalem and into the desert evoke in me a vivid imagery that is strongly related to my cultural origins. The actual telling of the story of Lehi and his family in the desert is done in only a few verses, while entire chapters cover that period of the family's experience. It's obvious that Nephi was much more interested in recording the spiritual context of the family's journey. The visions, the sermons, the exhortations, the spiritual context. Still, those few verses about the desert experience bring about intimate, personal, and emotive images. I believe that even through these events, even though these events took place millennia ago, their socio-geographical and cultural context seems to transcend the passage of time. I'm intrigued when I reflect how much these Middle Eastern cultural themes of the desert travel, the grief, the bonds of oaths, and the family structure impress themselves on Joseph Smith's mind. His impression from an ancient Near Eastern context is really impressive, especially from the Arabian context. He says on Laman and Lemuel, he says, reading the first few chapters of 1 Nephi has always left me with many questions concerning the motives and emotions of the main characters. This is probably due to the psychologist in me seeking for the deeper meaning behind the actions, especially when those actions seem to defy common sense. Such is the behavior of Nephi's elder brothers Laman and Lemuel, who in spite of witnesses' miracles and angels, they resist their father's wishes and fought against their brother Nephi. The most sympathy that these two characters receive from the average Book of Mormon reader is a shake of the head at their stiff-neckedness. And that's true. Most of us respond that way. That's true. But I read their story as a tragedy and an overturning of the family structure. The status of eldest brother within the Middle Eastern family is culturally entrenched and derives its strength from the culture's patriarchal structure. The eldest brother is the father-in-waiting, and he demands equal respect with the father. I think that it would have been even more so in the pre-industrial society of Lehi's time, when the first son would most likely have followed the father's career as he grew into the family's business or the trade. Lehi was surely troubled by the tensions between his sons. He understood his eldest son's need for respect, especially Laman's need in that regard. After leaving Jerusalem and traveling in the wilderness near the Red Sea for 3 days, the group camped. And this is where Lehi named the river there Laman, after his oldest son, and the valley Lemuel after his second son. I see this as a sign of Lehi's offering proper respect to these brothers, as well as trying to subdue their resistance to his plans. Now that's an interesting insight, isn't it? Only an Arabian could have had that insight. I like that very much. Laman and Lemuel's resistance to Nephi's leadership is disastrous to them and their children for generations to come. But is it much different from the conflicts between Cain and Abel, Esau and Jacob, and Joseph and his brothers? I wonder whether those stories of earlier sibling rivalry did not weigh heavily on Laman and Lemuel and fuel their sense of injustice and resentment as they saw themselves evolving into the role of the rejected, displaced elder brothers. Very interesting how an Arabian would notice that, isn't it? An Arab sees things that we just simply don't. On the idea of oath-taking, he has something very interesting to note on oath-taking also. When he discusses oaths in the Book of Mormon, it's filled with stories about bond relationships that rest on oaths. Now, most of these appear in negative contexts as part of secret and evil-doing societies, but in 1 Nephi we read of the story of Zoram, the servant of Laban. After Nephi killed Laban and disguised himself as Laban, he used Zoram to gain access to Laban's treasury and the plates of brass. Nephi then led Zoram outside the city gate, and when he had to reveal his identity to Zoram, he was able to bind him with an oath to follow him and take part in his family's journey into the desert. In fact, Nephi spoke to the servant Zoram with an oath, promising him freedom as well as safety and companionship if he would go with them. In return, Zoram gave an oath to Nephi that he would stay with them. Now, from any rational consideration, Zoram was under great duress, and whatever he agreed to do at that moment could not be seen as binding. But still, Nephi wrote that when Zoram made an oath unto us, our fears did cease concerning him. 1 Nephi 4:37. After that oath, Zoram's loyalty to Nephi, it was never really in question. Even in the most dire of situations, when Laman and Lemuel physically turned against Nephi, I think that Zoram remained loyal to Nephi, at least in part, because of his oath with him. Whenever I read this story, I am reminded of my years as a teenager, when my grandmother would call me to her and proceed to put me under oath that I would do her bidding before she even told me what it was that she wanted. I still remember the feeling of resistance that this generated in me. I must have known that whatever errand she thought to ask of me would not have been much trouble. But taking an oath imposed a much more demanding requirement on me. It was something of an archaic experience for my generation, but it was still very real, evoking a sense of solemn duty and obligation that could not be shirked. Recently, as I was reading the Book of Mormon, I came across the story of Amalickiah, a king of the Lamanites who was a Nephite by origin. When Amalickiah heard of his army's defeat by the hands of the Nephites, he was exceedingly wroth, and he did curse God and also Moroni, swearing with an oath that he would drink his blood. Alma 49:27. Now, as I read, I found myself translating the words into Arabic, as if they were how they were intended to be written. Now, I had known English for many years now, but I'm still not sure that I know how to curse God in English, or that I have ever heard anybody do that. Nor have I heard anyone take an oath to drink someone's blood. But in Arabic, both expressions are common. And unfortunately, I have heard both. On a preconscious level, that verse was more meaningful to me in Arabic